Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast.
I'm Rowena Itchon, COO of PRI, and with me is Lance Izumi, PRI Senior Director of Education. Hi, Lance.
Hey, Ro, nice to be on the podcast with you and Tim.
And Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. Hi, Tim.
Ro, I think we survived the State of the Union t-shirts after last night's speech.
So we are all former speechwriters. Lance was Director of Speechwriting for Governor Deukmejian and Attorney General Edwin Meese. And Tim was a speechwriter for Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger and many senior legislators in California. And I was a speechwriter for Governor Pete Wilson and was a research assistant on President Reagan's speechwriting team back in the day. And so we are all gathered to unpack President Biden's State of the Union address. So let's just jump in with the first question. You know, it's always a challenge for the president to have to deliver the State of the Union with the opposition party in charge of Congress. But that's exactly what President Biden had to do for the first time last night. So how do you think President Biden handled that challenge in this year's speech and why? So when I was at the White House under Ronald Reagan, there was always a divided Congress. And in the last 2 years, both houses were majority Democrat. So with this administration, I don't think there was ever a consideration to, what will the Republicans think if I say this or that? I think it is more, what will the viewers think? And obviously, most Americans want to see our government work together and work well. So President Biden had to try to appear as if he were unifying the parties. So he tipped his hat here and there to various Republicans and various programs. And I doubt his speechwriters had a high priority considered what Republicans in the House thought. But what I did find disturbing, however, was how Biden in his speech turned corporate America into an enemy. He never seemed to miss an opportunity to bash big pharma, big oil, big tech, the investor class. The list goes on. And he said, I'm a capitalist. But, he seems to also say, I hate the people who work there. I don't know why you would alienate and put down the people who make us the mightiest economy in the world. And thanks to, the U.S.'s unmatched engine of growth, the U.S. can do what it does and lead the world. So why would a U.S. president want to thwart an amazing engine? Makes no sense to me. So Lance, what do you think?
Well, when Biden started off his speech, I was, actually a little bit surprised and actually hopeful because, he started off by congratulating Kevin McCarthy on becoming speaker, saying that he was going to look forward to working together. And, and at first, he kept using the word bipartisan over and over again. And, I thought the speech was starting off on a good foot and that, well, maybe he might actually, have a change of heart from being kind of the partisan Democrat hack that he's been for most of his career. But, and I also think about how President Obama acted towards, a Republican majority when the Republicans, took control of Congress, under his presidency. And, Obama, he didn't really even bother to do an obligatory tip of the hat, really, to the fact that he now had divided government to contend with. And so, when Biden started off by emphasizing this bipartisanship, as I say, I thought that it was a hopeful sign. But then, the more he went into his speech, the less bipartisan he got. And he became, as you point out, Ro, he just laid out this laundry list of Democratic talking points about how evil corporations were, how evil, this sector or that sector of the economy was, want to tax everybody to death. And then I thought, though, that the whole bipartisanship theme just totally went off the rails when he got to the Social Security and Medicare part of the speech. And when he said, he tried to bring up the tired old Democratic trope of Republicans wanting to eliminate Social Security and Medicare. And there was this massive volcanic eruption from the House Republicans against that. And, and that was, to me, one of the defining moments of this speech, that you saw in real time Joe Biden implode because he had to then back off of what he had to say because of that reaction from the Republicans, and ended up saying, well, I guess we are all in support of Social Security and Medicare, and to me, that just showed how insincere, how disingenuous his whole bipartisanship theme was from the beginning, and that it was not meant to be a guide for his next 2 years, but was just something that was an obligatory speech writing trick.
Well, I don't think that Biden imploded. I think it was intentional. I think he went out of his way to put a thumb in the eye of the Republicans who, voted against his infrastructure bill. Remember that moment? But they still had projects funded in their districts. And he says, don't worry, we'll still fund them. I'll see you at the groundbreaking. I mean, that was just petty, and it certainly wasn't bipartisan at all. And, it seemed like, all his use of whenever he would say, my Republican friends want to do this, my Republican friends want to take the economy hostage, and it was all negative. And, I think on the jeering part, I mean, obviously they had to anticipate that was the reaction they were going to get. And it kind of made me wonder, is that the imagery they actually wanted? Did they think that he would get some sympathy or come across looking as the grown-up in the room, if you had everybody kind of angrily jeering at him? But yeah, I think that, it was pretty clear that all those words about bipartisanship, they really ring hollow. And the only kind of bipartisanship he's interested in is when Congress comes together around liberal priorities like his, sacred infrastructure bill that ballooned the deficit.
So, guys, the State of the Union addresses are naturally a time when presidents rattle off a laundry list of accomplishments to paint a picture of a successful administration. President Biden certainly did that in his speech last night. However, many Americans are struggling in today's economy and may not feel like happy days are here again. So watching the speech, how effective a job do you think the president did in selling his administration's accomplishments? Did he make the case or seem out of touch? Well, for me, the laundry list seemed a bit esoteric. A bridge here, a road there, climate change initiative, this and that. I don't think it satisfied the tangible needs of people right now. My mom the other day complained about $10 eggs and a heating bill that went up 3 times in January. And she's in this balmy Southern California town. She hates that I walk home at night because she believes there's a mugger in every corner, that she's watching this Chinese spy balloon floating all over the country every night. And she sees, these young people dying of fentanyl. My mother is a teacher. She loves young people. And of course, there are homeless people everywhere. And the president, what did he focus on? Junk fees, the new road in another state, the non-compete clause in employment contracts. It's not exactly on people's radar right now. Go ahead, Lance.
Well, I agree with you, Ro. It's expected that presidents, Democrat and Republican, are going to try and paint a rosy picture of their accomplishments, or what they perceive to be their accomplishments, and try to get that across to the American people. I realize that, but in Biden's speech, I thought it was only rosy picture stuff, and it really failed to understand where Americans are right now. 2/3 of the American people in most polls are saying that we're on the wrong path. And only 37% of Democrats want Biden to be the president or their nominee in 2024. So there are lots of people who have lots of problems with the way Joe Biden is doing his job and what his policies have produced. And it seemed as though Joe Biden didn't recognize that. Yeah, you can understand he wants to paint this picture of accomplishment, but there also has to be some sense of empathy for those people who think that he's not doing a good job, that he understands. Your mom, Ro, who is complaining about $10 eggs or worried about the national security of the country because of that Chinese spy balloon. There was none of that. So, Joe Biden, can use he kept using the term folks. It's like, inflation ain't that bad, folks. And he kept using that word folks, and as if that would be his connection with the American people. And the fact that he failed to understand where the American people really are and the challenges that they face in their everyday lives, but then uses that word folks, that comes across not so much as a connection, but as condescension to the American people. And I think that, Joe Biden's, this divergence between his picture of America and the America that people are living in their homes right now is so far apart that I don't think this speech did anything to bridge a gap.
Well, folks, I think that that laundry list of accomplishments, right? That's kind of a throwaway in every state of the union. I just thought it rang hollow, all this talk of 12 million new jobs. Roe's right. People don't feel like things are going well. And I think that laundry list of accomplishments wasn't really convincing. And really what struck me was how left-wing all of the things he was talking about were. It really was a sop to the left wing. All this talk about, the tax code is not fair. The corporations are not paying their fair share. Pass my proposal for the billionaire minimum tax. No, billionaires should be paying a lower tax rate than a school teacher. And side note, they aren't. Big oil profits. It's just not believable. Does anyone believe that his administration cut the deficit by $1.7 trillion? Certainly none of these things have any credibility, and not in a way that if your goal is to set up a environment to have successful bipartisan negotiations over the debt ceiling, it's really not the way to do it. And I totally agree with Roe on these sort of small issues. Bill Clinton was the hero, right, of kind of the small is better when he would talk about things like midnight basketball and school uniforms and those sorts of things in his State of the Unions. That may work in times of peace and prosperity, but we have so many challenges today, it just comes across as being tone deaf.
So we've got to move on to President Biden's oratorical gifts. So to put it kindly, President Biden is not the world's most gifted orator. So he's often challenged giving the most routine speeches, straining to get his words out perfectly and frequently flubbing his lines and making self-inflicted rhetorical wounds. How do you grade the president on his oratory skills for the State of the Union speech? Do you think this either helped or hurt him in selling his message to the American people? Well, we got to talk about this because as humble speechwriters, we know that what we write never really sticks and goes away after a few days, unfortunately. But what stays in people's minds are impressions. And I think President Biden's performance was worse than ever, frankly. And I'm actually sad to say this. Before his address, I actually thought that I would be used to the president's weak delivery and not really even think about it. But it was even more pronounced last night. He used to stumble and slur his words toward the end of his speeches, which is why I always thought that he should give shorter speeches. But last night, right off the top, he was already slurring and stumbling. And on top of that, he kind of gave this odd, accusatory, mean and angry persona. And if he didn't do that, he would seem like a frail old fella who deserves our kindness. He might announce his candidacy for president over the next few days, but I have to believe that I think that the nominee will be another Democrat. He could barely run the country now for the next 2 years, let alone another 6 years. So I don't think he was very effective at all in convincing the American people that he could handle another few years.
Well, I would say that, I agree with your observations, Ro. I particularly agree with the fact that, and what I thought was, most pronounced, even more than the slurring of the words, was that angry Joe came out. The same unappealing Joe Biden that we saw during, the campaign where, he would call people he, disagreed with or who challenged him, dog-faced pony soldiers, and things like that. It was that Joe Biden that came out in various parts of the speech. And I think that, his viewpoint was, or maybe the viewpoint of his handlers was that yelling equals strength. But actually, yelling doesn't equal strength. Yelling equals yelling. And oftentimes in Joe Biden's case, yelling actually signaled that there was total weirdness coming out of the president's mouth. I mean, like, for example, I thought that one of the weirdest outbursts from Biden during the speech was when he said that the very brief time he was talking about Red China, was what world leader would trade places with Xi Jinping? And like, he kept yelling that over and over. And it's like, well, wait, first of all, what does that mean? I mean, there are probably lots of world leaders who wouldn't mind being the totalitarian dictator of a superpower nation. And so it doesn't make any sense just from a logical point of view. But then, to keep yelling it at the members of Congress just didn't make any sense to me. And so it underscored not strength in the president, but again, those people who, a lot of people who say that, the president has, some mental, cognitive issues. That's what it underscored when you have an outburst like that.
I agree. I thought it was very fumbly from the beginning. I mean, right off the bat, he called Chuck Schumer the Senate Minority Leader. I mean, we all wish. And he fumbled over that joke about Jill Biden going to the Super Bowl next week. It's in a few days. Despite all the practice, and he apparently had more than 2 months of practice for the speech, he was just racing through the delivery, and it was actually kind of hard to discern at times what exactly he was saying. He trampled over a lot of lines. One thing I noted, he gave a line where he talked about 10 million small businesses were applying to open, and he turned to Kamala Harris for, I don't know why, I guess she had something to do with that effort. And I actually couldn't tell what he was saying. It was unintelligible. I thought that the yelling and the finger pointing was just very annoying. Of course, the use of the word folks, if that was your drinking game last night, you're drunk about 5 minutes in. I thought it was also very distracting. The squinting and the almost scowling on his face. And I'm sure some of that is, to see the words, but some of it, I think he's straining so hard not to say something dumb and not to trip over his words that it literally looked like he was scowling the entire time. And I agree with Lance, that shouting at the worst times, it's very jarring, and it really isn't effective delivery at all.
So one of the hallmarks of the State of the Union speech are the real Americans who are sitting in the balcony, who the president highlights in his speech to put a human face on a policy accomplishments or proposals. So President Biden's speech was no exception. Do you think the real Americans the president invited to his speech helped sell his plan to the American people? Or do you think these, quote, rhetorical props are overstated in the State of the Union? Well, for me, I think the most effective use of this was a speech that Donald Trump gave a number of years ago. I've never been in favor of using people like this, but I thought the way Donald Trump did it, I was moved and really blown away by the rhetoric and the use of examples. It was really heartwarming and very refreshing. Whoever did that speech, I don't know, was a very gifted writer. And I think his speech writers did an adequate job. These things, they look contrived. I really think speech writers did an adequate job. I don't know why they keep doing this. That's really all I have to say. Go ahead, Lance.
Well, I thought that, first of all, Ro, I think you're right that, I agree with your comments. I think that it's almost become a cliche now to use these folks in the gallery. But, that's not to say that the use that singling out some people isn't effective. I thought, the focusing on the Nichols family, I thought that was effective. I mean, who couldn't, have their heart, just, wrenched by what happened to their son and the circumstances, and to see them grieving in the gallery. I mean, it was very powerful, I thought. But then, what I thought, though, was that Biden and his team then really missed an opportunity, because Biden wants to be the unity president. He kept saying that during his speech. And he did say, while he was talking about what happened in Memphis, he did say that he realized and understood how hard it is to pin on the badge of a law enforcement officer. And I thought to myself, well, if you do realize how hard it is to pin on that badge, wouldn't it have been really amazing if, let's say, you had not only invited the Nichols family, but maybe you could have invited the families of, let's say, Darnell Calhoun, the African-American deputy sheriff from Riverside County here in California, and Isaiah Cordero, the Hispanic-American deputy sheriff from Riverside, who were both killed in January. And Calhoun's widow is pregnant with a child. If Biden really wanted to be this unity president, wouldn't it have been amazing to be able to look at the suffering of both the Nichols family and these law enforcement families who are suffering the losses of their loved ones for doing their duty? And that would have been a way, I think, to really heal the country, to truly unify the country. And, the Biden speechwriters, the folks who think about these things are, I think, just so locked into a certain narrative that I don't think they can think out of that box and really try and figure out a way, which I think this would have done, to really unify the country and heal wounds.
Well, I agree that the Nichols family, that was probably, I would argue, the strongest moment of the entire speech. It was very powerful, very relatable. You had a real call to action. And as you saw from the response, his words appeared to appeal to both sides of the aisle. I also thought to the who couldn't be touched by the parents of Ava, the little girl with cancer that beats the odds. I thought it was very touching. And, it reinforced one of the things that Biden, has talked about for a long time, is Cancer Moonshots Initiative. But I think, going back to our beginning thought, I think it's time that we all agree, let's ban the human props in the State of the Union.
That's right, Jim, but I don't know if that'll happen. It'll be earth-shattering if it does. And we'll all, as speechwriters, we will enjoy the speech a bit more. Let's look at the State of the Union in terms of the words on the page rather than the presentation itself. So what grade do you give the president's speechwriters for their work crafting this big address? Did the words on the paper effectively make the case the president wanted to make to Congress and to the public? I would say that it seems to me that given the president's situation now, my purpose would have been to shore up the party's base so that he gets the support for a run for his second term. And frankly, I don't think he was successful in that. No amount of dazzling speech crafting is going to help if the principal looks weak and frail and slurring and stumbling on his words. An AP poll showed that only 37% of Democrats want him to run again. And that's down from 52% from the same poll taken late last year. And among general election voters, only 22% want him to run again. So these are pretty dismal numbers. And if his goal, and it should have been his goal, is to try to improve these numbers, I don't think that this address helped him.
Well, Ro, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I would give the writers, unfortunately, we're all writers, but I'd give them a D. I think that they focused on this rosy picture of America too much and, diverge too greatly from what real Americans are feeling. I mean, you just have to look at, how the discussion that Biden, briefly made about the border, and like actually bragging about border apprehensions of human smugglers and, fentanyl and things like that, which is, just laughable given the massive invasion that's been going on for the 2 years of his presidency. And so, for him to brag about that and not, even acknowledge that there is a massive problem going on that, he needs to do something in the next 2 years to fix is, to me, just beyond belief. And for the writers, to put that into the speech without some kind of acknowledgement of the suffering that the people on the border and all throughout America are suffering because of the open border that we have, I just think, loses Joe Biden any credibility whatsoever. And for him to say that he wants to secure the border, now it's like, well, what have you been doing for the last 2 years? And I think the other thing too I would just mention is that, this is something that came from in some of the after comments by former Democratic Congressman Harold Ford. And he said that, Joe Biden basically didn't talk about certain key issues really like crime, and so, all the daily violence and fear that Americans are going through right now, Joe Biden didn't express any real view on that. He didn't empathize and sympathize with the people in these dangerous neighborhoods. And so, all he did was kind of deliver some Democratic platitudes, and that was about it. And so, I think that because, he really failed to understand, these crises that are going on, in American neighborhoods, I think that that's going to not improve his numbers like you had mentioned, Ro, but they're going to actually decrease them.
Well, I thought it was a very disjointed speech. I mean, you had kind of some lofty little section about bipartisanship, followed by some liberal laundry list. I mean, there was no real unifying theme for the speech. You could tell that it was written by committee, and as speechwriters, the worst kind of speech. There isn't always a big speech like this is a speech written by committee where, everybody has their fingers over it, and it's very hard to make it a good unifying address as far as the written word. In general, I just thought it was a lot of throwaway lines, a lot of old tired rhetoric, a lot of cliches. Really was not a memorable speech in any way as far as a written document. One of the things that I thought was very surprising was leaving any talk of China, which obviously there wasn't much talk about China at all, which I thought was a mistake, but leaving any talk of that to later in the speech, because given the gravity of the situation, usually when you talk about a foreign policy threat, that's a very unifying theme that would bring about a big applause lines and USA chants and, some patriotic unity. And I just don't understand why you would leave that to the end in favor of, these partisan rants right at the beginning. The other thing that struck me was it's like his speechwriters don't know about transitions. I noted literally in one passage of the speech, it went from a discussion of the border in one paragraph to Roe v. Wade the next, to LGBTQ the next, and then Ukraine. Do they give any thought to the organization of the speech? And obviously not. They felt they had to get in some other liberal talking points. So from a written text standpoint, I'd probably give it a C-.
So let's have a few rapid fire questions on aspects of the president's speech. So what do you think was the most memorable line from the president's speech? Were there any, quote, "ask not what your country can do for you," lines delivered last night? And I could give you a rapid fire answer. I would say no. Go ahead, Lance.
Well, I mean, they tried to have the phrase, "let's finish the job," be their big tagline. But I think, that really doesn't understand where the American people are. The fact that 70% or so, of Americans think we're on the wrong path right now means that they don't like the job that Joe Biden is doing so far. So do they want him to finish that job, continue to just give them more of the same, or do they want him to change course? Saying, "let's finish the job," just connotes more of the same. And that's not what the American people want. They want a course change right now. And, he's not going to give it to them.
I think the line when he was talking about the Nichols family and sharing their story and talking about the need to have some sort of police legislation, I think they call it the George Floyd Act, "something good must come from this." I thought that was a very memorable line.
What passage from the president's speech do you think was the most effective or most helpful to him in trying to achieve his administration's goals? For me, I thought the most memorable part of his speech wasn't so much any, particular language he used, but the part where I felt he was most genuine and most impassioned and he just wasn't reading his speech was when he talked about finding cures for cancer. And I was moved, like Tim, of the example of the little girl. I think that when he said those lines, they seemed very authentic, that he owned them, and he almost surmounted his, weak speech giving skills And actually, I think he had some rhetorical force there. Unfortunately, of course, as Sally Pipes would say, his healthcare agenda is doing exactly the opposite. It's not going to add more cures for cancer, but stop cures for cancer.
Well, I think that potentially the word bipartisanship, could have been an effective phrase for him. But I think it's really that term in this speech was kind of like a tale of two cities, the best of times and the worst of times. I thought at the beginning when he started off using bipartisanship, that it was effective, because I do think Americans want to see, cooperation between the parties to get something done for the American people. But, it devolved later in the speech, to the point where, you had the president basically throwing gasoline on the partisan fire, by bringing up Social Security and Medicare and, prompting the Republicans to react in a very understandable, very negative way. And so, all that goodwill that he started with, that he seemed to try to promote, all vanished, with that type of, really, I think, highly partisan performance towards the end.
I thought the best part of his speech was when he was talking about people falling behind. I thought he was very effective and relatable. We're building an economy where no one's left behind. Jobs are coming back. Pride is coming back. We talked about a blue-collar blueprint for America, and he really went through the challenges that working-class Americans are facing, for example, when they have a healthcare scare. Now, while we know the words ring hollow with how his policies will worsen healthcare for Americans, I thought that was a very effective and relatable part of his speech.
So what passage from the president's speech, if any, do you think stuck out and may have actually caused his administration more harm than good? Well, for me, I think that the line that was meant to be the hallmark of the speech, quote, "Let's finish the job," actually hurt him. Because if you look at the polls, it's not about finishing the job. It's actually about doing the job. And from the catastrophe in Afghanistan to incredible inflation, high gas prices, even this Chinese spy balloon making an odyssey across America, the optics are just not good.
Well, Ro, I think that, probably the line that it's going to come back to, really, put a noose around, the administration is, the line where he says, "We're in the strongest position to compete with China." And I just thought, really? Did he actually really say that? Not only because of the Chinese spy balloon. I mean, that's a terrible optic, like you said. But, interesting, or ironically, in a amazing sort of way, on the same day as the State of the Union, the Pentagon released a report that Communist China now has surpassed the United States in land-based fixed and mobile intercontinental ballistic missile launchers. So, how on the same day that the Pentagon releases such, shocking news that in this very important defense capability factor and measure that the Chinese have surpassed us, can Biden actually come out then and say that we're in the strongest position to compete with China ever? It just destroys any credibility that he has. And again, he can say that we're going to try to strengthen ourselves, but he needs to also acknowledge that, hey, our adversary is strengthening at a far greater pace than we are. And he then needs to make the case about how we're going to do something about it, or how he's going to do something about it.
I thought that when he said we're going to need oil for at least another decade, and the Republicans laughed out loud at him. I mean, it's just a farce, and it shows he doesn't get it. We need more domestic energy production, not more threats to shut down American energy, especially in light of all of our international challenges. And it's certainly not the way to get more votes, if you're him, in West Virginia or Pennsylvania or the Gulf Coast states.
So let's turn our attention to the person with the toughest assignment that night, Arkansas Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who delivered the Republican response. So how effective a job do you think she did in presenting the Republican alternative? Did she, as a spokesperson, close the stature gap in presenting the opposing view of the president? And what do you make of the written speech she gave and setting in which she delivered it? Well, I thought it was one of the best responses in a long time. If we had leaders like her, I would be happy to ride off into the sunset. I thought it was a formidable speech. I love that she juxtaposed normal and crazy, because that's what a lot of Americans are feeling now, that we've gone off the deep end when it comes to American culture. And if you lay over that, the sputtering economy and our spineless reaction to our international adversaries, well, things are crazy. And I thought it was a successful speech, and I wish her well as governor of Arkansas.
Well, I agree with you, Ro. I thought it was a fabulous speech. I thought she did incredible. We all agree that it's so difficult for anyone to give the response to the State of the Union, regardless of Democrat or Republican. But she gave an amazing speech. She gave an intimate speech in an intimate setting. So, she did what she was supposed to do. She contrasted, reality with Biden's fantasy world, and really, I think connected with what Americans are really facing in their lives. And I agree with you that line, that it's not a question of left versus right anymore. It's a question of normal versus crazy. And Biden is doubling down on crazy. I thought those were great lines in that speech. And I think that her recollection of President Trump's secret Christmas flight to Iraq was very powerful. And her stories about how the ordinary soldier really loved President Trump, and really identified with what he was doing was very heartwarming. And so, I thought she was able to both make policy cases, but then also had great rhetorical flourishes and really connect with people in a type of situation which often trips up so many very prominent politicians in making this response to the State of the Union.
Well, I disagree with you both. I think it was a very actually disappointing speech. I think it was kind of a lost opportunity. It really was, I thought, a tale of two speeches. I thought the first half of the speech was very negative, very partisan. Yes, of course, you need to contrast yourself with the party in power, but people already know why we're not happy with the direction of the country. They want to have some sort of sense of what is the alternative going to be? What are you going to do? And I don't think she provided that on behalf of Republicans. Yes, she tried to make it a generational appeal, as she's the next generation versus Biden being stuck in the past. And of course, she had that obvious visual contrast on the screen. But I don't think she really presented any ideas to show that Republicans are the party of the future and Democrats are the party of the past. Now, the second part of the speech, where she was talking about the trip to Iraq and how America's unique because we're the most free country on earth, that was quite good and quite powerfully delivered. And I think that's where the lost opportunity comes in. I think she should have had more of the speech resemble the second half of her remarks and have a lot less of that angry, negative partisanship that she had in the first part of her speech.
So, as speechwriters, we spend a lot of time watching and dissecting the president's big speech. But it begs the question, was our watching the president's speech numerous times all for naught? Will anyone even remember anything from it next week or even tomorrow for that matter? Of course, I've said this before, the answer is no. By the end of this week, it'll all be forgotten. But I stress again, people might forget what Biden said, but they're not going to forget this picture of him in their minds, but a weak fella, stumbling and slurring on his words, shaking his fist at corporate America, which is where, an army of middle class and working class Americans work. I think he's lucky if Americans totally forget his speech. That would be a positive thing.
Well, and I agree with you, Ro. I do think that Americans will forget it. I mean, I don't know what the ratings were. Sure, a lot of Americans didn't tune in. But I think that the fact that we've talked a lot in this podcast about Biden having lost opportunities, for actually making a better case for himself, really connecting with the American people. I think that's the thing that's going to end up being the big reverberation from this speech, that it was this giant missed opportunity for Biden to really save his presidency, and he, instead of saving it, I think he torpedoed it.
The ratings actually are in, and an estimated 23.4 million people tuned in, which is down significantly from his speech last March, which drew 38.2 million viewers. So maybe they were trying to forget it before the speech was delivered. I know Lance has tried to forget it for every moment since then, and he may have some PTSD from having to listen to it again. But I think what sums it up best is a line that Speaker McCarthy posted on Instagram last night. Did you ever have really good seats to a really bad sports event? And I think that sums up what we all had to endure last night. I think it was forgotten as soon as the words came out of his mouth. But Ro is right. A picture is worth 1,000 words.
So thank you, Lance. Thank you, Tim. And from Lance, Tim, and myself, thanks everyone for listening to Next Round. And we hope to see you back next week.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.